was the theme from Andy Griffith. Scientism. Yeah. Scientism is its own little religion. It doesn't follow Aristotelian, Platonic, or Pythagorean principles of the term science. They're not really truth seekers today, but they are mathematicians. And mathematicians love to count things, and one of the fundamental posterior attributes of a mathematician is thinking that things are separate. We got one here and two here. They're both rocks, but they're different. Just pigeonholing things. Human beings love to pigeonhole things. And they also, too, love to engage in concept reification. There's a list of about 7. I don't know if I remember all 7, possibly 9. Depends on what you're... we could argue about the last 2. Things that don't actually exist. Things that don't actually exist are time, space, shadows, emptiness, and waves. Yeah? Time is only a measure. Space is only the posterior attribute of a divergent force in motion magnetic field, i.e. a torus. In other words, the posterior attribute of a divergent three-dimensional S-curve is the creation of the volume of this torus. So time, space, shadows, of course, don't exist. Shadow is posterior attribute set of something else. The absence of light. Emptiness, of course, doesn't exist. It is a qualifier set of something else. It is nothing other than a lost via negativa apophatic methodology. However, a lot of modern people talk about emptiness. I love when someone says they experienced emptiness. Like, oh, did you experience emptiness? Yes, I did. It was very profound. Okay, so you were in the emptiness when you see, of course I was, otherwise. Well, no one could say anything without having a qualifier to speak about it. So what's the qualifier of emptiness? How did you know you were in emptiness? Well, there's nothing there. It was very profound. But you were in it, right? Yes, I was in it. Okay, so it wasn't empty by definition. Well, what qualifier by which could you say that you experienced? See, no one could actually talk about experiencing anything if it doesn't exist. That's like someone talking about experiencing the joy of spending a day with a unicorn. It's like, well, you might have had a dream about frolicking with a unicorn, in which case it would be, peripherally valid and yet a complete phantasm, but, you couldn't have experienced emptiness. Waves, too, there's another great one, because there's no such thing as a wave. A wave is what something does, not what something is. Today's modern scientists, unfortunately, suffer from a lot of this belief system. It is a belief system. They objectify and they separate out things. And this is one of my favorite authors of all time. He attacked Albert Einstein endlessly. I have a couple copies of this book. This one's heavily underlined. It's called Causality, Electromagnetic Induction and Gravitation by Dr. Oleg D. Yefimenko. He had 2 PhDs, I believe. He wrote a brilliant book on mathematics. And yet he himself, in his great brilliance, and I wished he was still alive, his great brilliance still didn't get it, because him, identical to the rest of the scientists out there, they suffer the belief that there are these different things. Well, here we have electricity, here we got magnetism, here we have the dielectric or the electrostatic, and over here we got gravity. That's as childish as a child who thinks that ice is one thing, steam is, well, steam is hot and it's vaporous, and ice is cold and hard, and water is wet and liquidy, and well, it's all the exact same thing. Mother Nature's divine simplicity and having a primer within your head on understanding cosmic mechanics means that you don't make these fundamental mistakes. Now, Dr. Oleg D. Yefimenko, and he is incredibly praiseworthy, and he points out a lot of the misunderstandings of Maxwell. This is the only book on earth that points out the hidden gems within James Clerk Maxwell's writing. And James Clerk Maxwell, I don't know if you know or not, was a god of electrical theory, even more so than Nikola Tesla. Tesla, of course, was a genius inventor, but James Clerk Maxwell was the god of the math and foremost in understanding electrical theory. But Dr. Oleg D. Yefimenko actually points out the confusions, and he admits that he is confused, and he points out these facts, and this is why this is such a brilliant book. But Dr. Oleg D. Yefimenko himself still doesn't understand it, because he's still thinking with a terrestrial viewpoint, a conventional bipedal organism, i.e. a human, A lot of people think I'm an alien. I just use that as a joke, dry humor. That these things are different. Electricity is one thing, electromotive induction is another, magnetism is something else. Here I'm going to read from Dr. Oleg Jefimenko. But as we've seen, neither Maxwell's equations nor their solutions indicate an existence of causal links between the electric and magnetic field. And the reason for that is that electricity is a hybrid of dielectricity and magnetism. There's not a causal link because they're one and the same thing. Magnetism is a subcomponent of the electrical field. And neither Jefimenko ever understands this, nor did James Clerk Maxwell. Therefore, we must conclude an electromagnetic field is a dual entity, always having an electrical and magnetic component. Actually, that's almost correct. We should have said, therefore, we must conclude that an electromagnetic field is a dual entity, well, not really dual, having a dielectric and magnetic component simultaneously created by their common sources, time-variable electrical charges and currents. Because that's all the generation of electricity is. And no AC generator actually generates electricity, as I've said before in other videos. What they do is they manifest energy in electricity, and of course they guide it along a dielectric reflector. Energy is never generated. Like spontaneous generation. Well, it's an AC generator, you're crazy. No. There is no transference of the kinetic energy of wind or of water, hydroelectric, or nuclear, which is nothing other than a giant steam turbine. There is no transference of energy. What it happens is that kinetic energy is sent through an arch form, and that's all an AC generator is an arch form. My book is falling apart, as you can see. That arch form, when actually put into motion with and adding a time variable, causes ether torsion, and that ether torsion modality is called electricity. Of course, we use that electricity, but no AC generator actually generates electricity. They manifest electricity, and that is a huge distinction with a difference that nobody else has written about. The only person that's talked about that in any video is me, by the way. Not that I'm tooting my own horn, but it's a distinction with a difference. If people understand that, because they'll say, well, there's Nikola Tesla's AC generator, which is still, active and alive up in Niagara Falls. The water falls, turbine's turned, generates electricity. So what are you saying, manifest versus generate? I mean, we know that electricity is, is created, and in that sense that's correct, created because electricity is a hybrid of dielectricity and magnetism. But the distinction that there is somehow a transference of kinetic energy to electricity is a misnomer. When a wind blows a wind turbine, high up on the end of its big pole there, there's nothing of the wind nor its kinetic energy that is transmuted into energy. It's not. The only thing that happens is a time variable is set in motion with the actual so-called AC generator, whereby which electrical power is made manifest. That's all an AC generator is an arch form for the manifestation of energy, which of course human beings do consume. No AC generator generates electricity, does not. It manifests it, and that is a huge distinction. Getting back to Dr. Oleg Jefimenko here. In other words, it appears there can exist sourceless electromagnetic fields, sourceless electromagnetic waves. Of course, there's no such thing as waves, I pointed out. So, however, according to equation V28, such fields are impossible, since there is no doubt that it does require a wave field. Anyway, he's confused there. There's some amazing stuff for this book that he actually discovers in the math. He's a very, very brilliant mathematician. Why? Because I wished he was still alive. Brilliant mathematician, Dr. Oleg Jefimenko. His books are very, very brilliant. He very dryly and academically attacks Einstein, because Einstein was incorrect. He attacks Einstein on the notion of GPS satellite correction having anything to do with bending of space-time. They're electrokinematic fields which cause GPS temporal correction for fast-moving GPS satellites, not warped space-time as is postulated by relativity. According to these equations, my book is falling apart here. According to these equations, in time-variable systems, electrical magnetic fields are always created simultaneously. We see there's the misnomer that Jefimenko doesn't understand. The magnetic and the electric are both the same thing. Magnetic is just a subcomponent to the binary field modality that we call electricity, are always created simultaneously because they have a common causative source, the changing electrical current. Once created, the two fields coexist from then on without any effect upon one another. Therefore, electromagnetic induction, as a phenomenon in which one field creates the other, is an illusion. Now that is accurate. They don't create each other because they're both one and the same thing. Ice, water, and steam are both one and the same thing. You know, water and steam don't mutually create one another. Water and steam are the exact same thing in near perfect analogy. The illusion of mutual creation arises from the fact that the time-dependent systems in the two fields always appear predominantly together, while their causative sources, time variable current in particular, remain in the background. But if the two fields are created simultaneously and coexist from then on as a dual entity, then our concept of electromagnetic induction requires thorough re-examination. Well, you're right about that. We shall start a re-examination by reviewing the history of this concept. I don't want to get into the history of electromagnetic induction, but this is what happens in academia. These people can't see the forest for the trees. And as brilliant as Dr. Oleg Djefamenko is, very, very brilliant, way more brilliant than the rest of them. Not as brilliant as Tesla, not as brilliant as James Clerk Maxwell, but very brilliant. He's right up there with him. They still suffer from this idea that electricity is and magnetism, and we have electromotive force over here. And they're worried about how they're mutually interacting. Well, they're not mutually interacting because they're all one and the exact same thing. Yeah, ice, water, and steam are one and the same thing. We only have different names for them such that they have different phase states. Solid state, liquid state. Also, too, there's a plasma state of water. Now I don't have to talk about the plasma of water. A gaseous state of water, i.e. steam. All these scientists suffer from the same thing. They suffer from this disease, a mental malady that all mathematicians suffer from. And that is, they don't believe it if they can't count it. You know, this is something here, and we count that as one. This is something different over here. Mother Nature doesn't work like that. If you actually genuinely, truly have the primer in your head of cosmic mechanics and what Mother Nature is and how simple she is, she's a hippie chick in a hemp skirt with muddy feet and hairy armpits and dreadlocks. And she doesn't have a calculator. Yeah? You don't need a calculator to create this simplicity. This is nothing other than the one in exponential manifestation because, you know, this is a crosscut of a nautilus shell. I say, well, this is the golden ratio. It's like, yeah, you keep saying golden ratio, but you don't understand what the golden ratio is. You can't explain it. You don't know what it is. It's the one in multiplicity. Just as the Fibonacci sequence goes 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, we're actually having the additive Cartesian remanifestation in harmonic simplicity of 1. This isn't math. This is the mirage of the absolute, or the agathon, or of infinity in counter space. We could say counter space, we could say subspace, we could say ultimate reality, we could say the Akashic realm, doesn't matter what you want to call it. You know, this is beautiful. Everybody on Earth recognizes this as beautiful, perfect geometry. They recognize it as a simplex, golden ratio harmonic. But what it is the multiplicity of 1 in manifestation. That's all the golden ratio is, because phi is to 1 as 1 is to phi. There is not electricity, and there's not over here magnetism and over here dielectricity. These are all one and the same thing. And if you don't understand that, you'll never, ever, ever understand Mother Nature. It's completely impossible. I love a famous quote from Eric Dollard. He was giving a lecture, and he was accurate. I don't care if you call it counter space or subspace. Who cares? He says, you will never, ever, this is a quote from Eric Dollard, he says, you'll never, ever, ever understand electrical theory without understanding counter space. And he is exactly correct. Because you'll never understand the reason or the premise behind the smaller the space, the higher the capacitance. As you increase the voltage on power lines, they actually pull together towards counter space. When you actually increase the magnetic along the power lines, they actually push themselves apart. It's the conjugate geometry of the entire universe, the spatial and counterspatial, or respectively the dielectric and the magnetic. I hope I kept this kind of simple. I love this book. I've read it probably 10 times. It's full of a lot of really complex math equations, which nobody really needs to understand Mother Nature. But even him, in his great brilliance, didn't understand things fundamentally didn't understand them. These scientists and academia and mathematicians are just lost. They're counters. They're bean counters. He was much less of a bean counter. He was a true genius, but still he didn't understand. I wished he were still alive today, but such is the case. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.